Okay, so let me try to recall where we were last time. So last time I showed you that if you do, so we are computing the partition function of a massless scalar on this space-time manifold. So there were d minus one large dimension, there was one small spatial dimension, which is in electromagnetism the distance of the plates, but otherwise the periodic circle on which the massless scalar field is. This is the one which is small, and then if you do the partition function, the other circle that was in the game was the thermal circle, because you have periodic boundary conditions in Euclidean time. And then I hope I have convinced you by this zeta function computation that you can prove that the partition function generalizes something that you know from 2D conformal field theory, namely that it's given in terms of this real analytic Eisenstein series. This is a double series which involves tau and tau bar, and this object here is modular invariant, and then there was a specific factor of tau 2, which is beta over L3, if you want, which was here, which was responsible for the fact that it's only modular covariant and not modular invariant, the full result. Okay, and now, so this was I would say, the Lagrangian computation. So are there any questions on that before I continue? So the next thing to do is one should do the Hamiltonian approach to this computation. In the Hamiltonian approach, so this was really the Lagrangian path integral computation, going through the zeta function computation. And now, since in this case you know exactly all your oscillators of the theory, you know your degrees of freedom, you can really do the computation by doing the trace over the Hilbert space and compute everything. Okay, if you do that, there is one bit that we already computed, which was the Casimir energy. That was the stuff that we discussed also by zeta function very quickly last time. And so you realize that if you do the canonical approach and do diagonals, the Hamiltonian, exactly like we discussed when there was one small dimension, which was only time, and all the rest was large, you know how to diagonalize the Hamiltonian, you put everything in, and you do really the trace, and you manipulate these integrals. The one tricky term which is still divergent is this Casimir energy, but then this one, that's the 0-point energy of the system. It's the leading contribution to the partition function. You have to do it in some way, and one of the ways is the zeta function that I explained last time. But then the Hamiltonian result, if you are done and work it through completely, you find the following result. So in this case, because the d minus 1 dimensions are large, you factorize only by this trick of going from sums to integrals. You only factorize a volume Vd minus 1 in front of everything, and then you have this expression here. And the end result of the computation, which I'm not going to do, but which you can find also basically in monographs on finite temperature Casimir physics. So this is the kind of result that you are going to find. Plus 2 LD over beta, d minus 2 over 2, sum prime and d, sum L belonging to star, something slightly awful, but completely computable. Two pi L and d over beta LD, and then to finish it off, 2 pi L. Well, it looks of course completely awful, but once it's so nice that you can compute something completely to all orders and make it exact. So that's why I'm giving it completely. So I should explain all the terms that are there. So that's the result of canonical quantization of the partition function, where you control exactly the microstates and you diagonalize the Hilbert space and you can compute everything. So this factor I already explained. It's more or less, you get it from this integral over the continuous dimension over the ones that you make large, exactly like we had in this zeta function approach. Then this thing is just a rewriting. So let me discuss the terms. This I call the term 1. This is the second term. And all of that stuff here is the third term. Or the third terms which are there. So what do you realize? So the first thing to say is the only divergence is in the computation of the Casimir energy, no other divergences. This is a general result about finite temperature field theory. In this kind of computation, the only subtraction that you have to do is for the Casimir. All the rest, kind of finite temperature makes all the rest finite. Okay, maybe let me start with the last terms. So I should tell you what, so K is the modified Bessel function of second kind. You look it up and the good thing about this object here is that you know how it behaves if Z is large, okay, order of Z minus 1. Okay, and Z, you see that this is beta over LD. So what does beta over LD mean? Beta over LD large means low temperature or small box, right? Beta is 1 over temperature. So you see that the expansion that you get naturally from canonical quantization is adapted to the low temperature limit, to having an expansion in low temperature, not the usual classical high temperature limit. Okay, so beta over LD much bigger than 1 means so small temperature slash small box. And this is where quantum effects are very strong. And usually the other limit, beta over LD very small, is the classical limit, right? This is that's why also this Casimir term is going to dominate in this expansion. So you know that all these terms, because you know the behavior of this modified Bessel function at for large Z, you know that this is exponentially suppressed and that you don't need to care about it so much. So if you're interested in what happens at almost zero temperature or for a very small box, all these terms are exponentially suppressed. That's one thing that you can see. Okay. And then you have to discuss the first term. So the first term is minus beta times E0, and this E0 are computed for you by zeta function methods. I compute it for you. So I indicated that you can do it in the same way before. So this is the Casimir energy, the contribution of the Casimir energy to the partition function. And it's the dominant contribution at low temperature, I should say, low temperature small box. And then the interesting contribution, one very interesting contribution is this one. And when you compare what I had given you before for the black body result, you see that the subdominant contribution is actually the black body result for a massless scalar in one lower dimension. Let me write it down. So 2 is the black body result in one dimension less. D-1 spatial dimensions. Remember that last time we spent a bit of time of doing this black body partition function in all generality, in all dimensions, and we had them for d is equal to 1, 2, 3, and you find the d is equal to, well, the d-1 result you find inside of this partition function for the thing here. And since you know completely your Hilbert space, and this is, so in this computation, you still know exactly which oscillators give which result to the partition function. This is no longer necessarily true if you use zeta function and these path integrals. So in this case, you know that this contribution comes from, so it comes from the oscillators whose frequency, whose angular frequencies have nd equal to 0. So remember that there was this double sum, there was this Matsubara sum in here, so this thing contains something which has nd plus 1 and nd. This had to do with the fact that you have periodicity in the temperature, and this had to do with the fact that you have periodicity in the spatial direction. Okay? And here you can see that this contribution to the partition function is the one where nd is equal to 0. So sometimes I say what happens in, so you see that this comes if nd is equal to 0, and if nd is equal to 0, if you go back to the three-dimensional case, d is equal to 3, and you think again about your plates, this has to do with photons or gravitons or particles that propagate parallel to these plates. And it has really to do with these Neumann boundary conditions that we had, with this additional sector that was in the analysis of this. So photons or gravitons, of course here it's translated into scalars, but that, so this had to do with the fact that there are more E modes than H modes, and the ones that you have more for n3 equal to 0 are precisely the ones which propagate parallel to the. Why do I insist on that so much? Because now you can compute, because of course if you have the partition function, you can compute all thermodynamic quantities, and the one thermodynamic quantities that one is often interested in is the entropy. So the formula for the entropy out of the partition function is the following. So the entropy is given by 1 minus beta d over d beta applied to ln of z of beta, and here alpha is just passive. Okay. So what does it mean if you use this formula at low temperature on this expansion and you say that you are at low temperature? So this is very convenient because what this formula tells you, this basically counts the power of betas that you have there, and you have 1 minus beta d beta. So I'm not talking about the exponentially suppressed terms. They are irrelevant at low temperature small box. So you only have to look at the first terms, the first two terms, and 1 minus beta d over d beta precisely annihilates the Casimir energy. Okay, the Casimir energy does not contribute to the entropy. Okay. So only the second term is, so the subdominant term in this expansion at low temperature is giving the leading contribution to the entropy. And of course, when you work it out, so at low temperature, so what you are finding from this is, so you get the power d, because you have to do 1 minus, oh, I hope it's true. You get psi d, and then you get vd minus 1 over beta d minus 1. So you see that at low temperature, if d is equal to 3, you see that the entropy scales like the area and not like the volume. And this is not what you expected in this case, right? Not what you expected from the high temperature thing, where it scales like the volume, as we are going to see. So that's surprising, how the temperature, how the entropy scales at, at low, and this has not a lot to do with black holes or horizons or so on. So there are systems. It's a very simple system in which the temperature scales like the area. And in general, I would say the scaling of the entropy at low temperature is, you cannot just say it's so many degrees of freedom per space-time point and then see that it's twice, it's always volume, as you can see. Okay, so that's one point I wanted to make. It's not completely clear to me how deep it is or how relevant it is for black hole physics, but it is for sure true that, well, at least to me, this was very unexpected. Yes?
Is this not just the consequence of the fact that you sort of localized modes at your boundary in your description? Because you have these extra modes that are...
But okay, this is actually a nice question. Okay, I don't think this has something to do with soft degrees of freedom. They are still hard degrees of freedom. For a long time I thought it had to do with them, because they are also kind of lower dimensional, because you know they come from these Neumann boundary conditions, and effectively they are like a lower dimensional thing. But they are not in any sense directly soft modes. So they are not related to this sector of the partition function that I left out, which is this AA, which is a gauge transformation, but only on the boundary. And at some stage I was confusing these two sectors. But then again, so it's very funny you asked this question, because yesterday in this Edinburgh workshop they asked exactly the same question. So Juan Simon, your collaborator, asked exactly the same. And so even though as you know very well, these asymptotic symmetries, they act both on the soft sector and on the hard sector. If you do it in BMS, you can see that they act both on the bonded mass aspect and on these things, but they also, there is a representation of that on all the subleading stuff. So also on the sigma, on the gravitational, on the hard sector, I would say. So somehow, even though in the beginning I was very confused, I now believe that this is part of the hard sector, but it is a two-dimensional subset, or lower dimensional subsector of the hard sector. And the soft stuff should still be on top of it. Okay, at least that's what I think. But it is true that it has to do with the fact that your boundary conditions are non-trivial, and that when you look at all your modes, you have more than what you naively expect due to the boundary conditions. That's for sure true. Okay, now, just since this is more lectures than a course where, than a research talk where I talk about the original stuff that we have been doing, it would be a pity not to talk about the Casimir force, because everything is set up to give the Casimir force. So let me just quickly tell you what it is. So the Casimir force, of course, you know all the thermodynamics, so you can look at the free energy of the system. So the free energy is this thing. And the free energy starts with it starts off with the Casimir energy, and then, well, maybe let me put D is equal to 3 here, because then it is really, D is equal to 3, and L3 should be equal to 2D, where 2D is the separation of the plates. Then I have this completed zeta function psi3, L1, L2 over beta squared, and then exponentially suppressed terms. So the Casimir force, I have not really understood if it's the right definition. I can more or less believe it. You know that the force is the derivative of the potential with respect to the distance, right? What people are telling you is that the Casimir force is in general, you should think of it as minus the derivative of the free energy with respect to the derivative of the separation of the plates, if you want, the derivative with respect to L3. That's the Casimir force in that case. okay? And what is very interesting, okay, and you kind of, I only can believe it in this classical thing when I know that if you have a potential, it's the derivative of the potential with respect to x that gives you a force. But they say that this is, in general, the right expression for the force. So this is this attractive force that acts between these two plates, right? And if you compute it, and you realize then why in the Casimir literature this sector is sometimes completely neglected, even though it's the dominant contribution to the entropy. They are not interested in the entropy, but in the force. But this term does not contribute to the Casimir force because it's L3 independent. So the point I want to make is so this is the Casimir force. Does not contribute, and the leading contribution comes from the Casimir energy, obviously, and you can work it out, and if you work it out, so the leading contribution comes from E0, not from, so now this term lies in the kernel of the force, if you want. Okay, so the leading contribution, when you work it out, you get this famous number, so you get minus 3 over xi 4 L1 L2 over 2d to the power 4, and then you work it out and you get something like minus I squared over 240. I hope I didn't make a mistake. L1, L2, it's proportional to the area, by the way, d to the power 4. So that's the Casimir force that you can find in the books on the Casimir effect. Okay, and a last thing I wanted to say on that is now, okay. Okay, I wanted to make another remark which is of mathematical nature. So, of course, you know that the result that you have computed through Lagrangian methods and through this Hamiltonian operator approach should be the same. So, and if you use that, and you just turn the reasoning around, so you have two expressions for the partition function. One is the one that you get by zeta function computation, and the other by canonical quantization. Then you compare these two expressions, you strip off everything which is irrelevant, and you compare this thing to what is left. What you are going to find is that the Hamiltonian quantization is giving you what is known in the mathematics literature as the Fourier transform of the real analytic Eisenstein series. So just writing these two quantities to be equal gives you, so you can check, and with that you can check that you have made no error in any of the two computations, or at least that they are compatible. You find the Fourier transform. So why has this a Fourier transform? This has a Fourier transform because you have both this tau. So the modular invariance has two things which are important, which generate the full modular transformation. There is this inversion, which is related to temperature inversion symmetry, and then there is the, I think you call it T transformation, which tells you that this object is invariant under tau goes to tau plus 1. Okay? But what this means is that this is a periodic function in tau, so you can do a Fourier transform of this in tau. Okay? And mathematicians and other people, and also, for instance, Axel in his book on real analytic Eisenstein series, they discuss what is the Fourier transform of the real analytic Eisenstein series. And here you find that the equivalence between these two quantizations gives you the Fourier transform of the real analytic Eisenstein series. Okay, so that's reassuring, because then you know both computations are correct and compatible and everything. So that's one remark. The other remark is, so this remark has to do with the T transformation. Now you can use the fact that you know that the result is modular invariant to relate the low temperature to the high temperature behavior, because you know how it behaves under this, and this allows you, if you use this in the correct way, you can relate low and high temperature, and you find that at high temperature, so you can work out the high temperature expansion. And this is also, of course, related to this Cardiff formula and to this trick where you always use this kind of thing here. So you find that the high temperature expansion, if you work it out, is going to be Vd minus 1 over alpha squared plus beta squared to some power, d minus 1. Then you get psi d plus 1, LD beta over alpha squared plus beta squared, because you do it with the alpha present, plus psi d alpha squared plus beta squared over LD beta to the power d minus 1, plus exponentially suppressed terms. So, and then you put alpha to 0, because the discussion is easier. You put alpha to 0, and then you look at what remains. If you put alpha to 0, now in the high temperature thing, you see that Vd minus 1 with the LD becomes really the spatial volume as you need it. So in the high temperature expansion, the leading contribution is really the volume now, okay? Times the right power of beta. If you do it correctly, you will see that you have a beta d plus 1 or something like that remaining, exactly the one that you need. So this probably means that here I made, of course, a mistake. Because remember that what one needs is Vd psi d plus 1 over beta d, right? That's what one needs. That's exactly what you remain with in this case. Okay, so you really get the black body result and everything is consistent from this thing. And you see that also with finite boundary conditions, even in the high temperature expansion, it's only true that the electromagnetic result, which you get when you put LD is equal to 2 times D, or sorry, L3 is equal to 2 times D. Well, you realize that D is not a good name for this, because, but so you realize that the standard law that electromagnetism is twice the scalar field result is only good for the leading term. It's no longer good for this term because it's not going to work for any of the subleading stuff. Okay, but in this high temperature computation, because often when you do it explicitly, you use the Poisson summation formula in this thing, you lose the ability to tell what oscillators, what part of the Hilbert space is really responsible for what contribution. This you could say very easily in the low temperature limit, but it's less clear, at least it's not clear to me how to disentangle it in the high temperature. Very good. Okay, so that was part of what I wanted to say. So now, yes.
Regarding your partition function, is there some way to interpret the terms also as coming, so, I mean, from some settle point approximation where beta is large, and then the first term is the classic base, the second term is the rest are instant.
Very good. There should be a way like that. This has to do with the seed kernel thing that I was not yet talking about. And you know from your Feynman and Hibbs or something that there's this very nice chapter where they explain how classical statistical mechanics is the limit of constant path of quantum statistical mechanics. So really, and then you have this Wigner-Kirkwood expansion. So this should be, so the constant power, the path which satisfy your classical boundary conditions dominate, and with that you do a semi-classical expansion, exactly like you are saying.
Yeah, but if that interpretation applies, then it's a bit interesting that there's only one loop correction, and it's just a D loop term. I mean, the second term is sort of would be your loop correction, and all the rest are just exponentially suppressed instanton correction. So is there some
it is a question that we had, that we have not been able to. We were already very happy to do it like that, but you see, usually, at least what I have seen when you do this path integral approach and you do the perturbation theory is with respect to the potential that you have in the thing. And here, everything is quadratic, it's p squared, and everything can be solved exactly. So, what is the expansion? It is a question I troubled Francesco with, and I tried at some stage, but we have not been able to do it exactly in these terms, which is a real pity, because it's a very natural question. We have been able to do it also, we have been doing it with more general tori and things like that. We have been able to do it using this modular invariance, tau goes to our 1 over tau, and then from the fact that you know how they are, but we have not been doing it in terms of, completely in terms of instantons and in these terms. It is something I think that we still should do. Because it's a very, and you confirm that this is a very natural question. Okay, we haven't done it like that. Maybe we can discuss it. Okay, now there is an option of what to do next. So either I talk a bit about, but only qualitatively about this third approach of computing the partition function using the heat kernel world line approach, in which you see this path that wind around the circle explicitly, and you don't need any approximation. So I can talk a bit about that in more general terms, or I can talk about the gravitons, but I don't think I can do both. So one is about kinematic. So one will be repeating E and H modes, or at least qualitatively, to tell you how they work in linearized GR. And the other would be expand a bit on how this heat kernel method goes and what it gives you in terms of this partition function. Any preferences? Both I cannot do. That's completely clear.
We vote or what?
You vote.
We vote?
You don't care. That's also good.
The heat kernel?
The heat kernel?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, but we could vote, huh?
2 against 0.
Yeah, so the gravitons, okay, let me do the heat kernel. Let me quickly, very quickly say how the gravitons go and give you more details, and then I will do the heat kernel. So how do the gravitons go? At least what is the kind of computations that you have to do? So for the gravitons, the first thing that you need if you want to control the degrees of freedom is do the Hamiltonian formulation. So there are two ways to do the Hamiltonian formulation. Either you start with the Pauli-Firth spin-2 action, and you do the Dirac analysis for that. You don't want to do that. That's tedious. And okay, but of course, this gives you the Hamiltonian formulation of Pauli-Firth's massless spin-2 theory. Of course, you can use the work that has already been done. You can start from the Hamiltonian ADM formulation of full gravity, provided you have read chapter 21 of Misner, Thorne, and Wheeler. You use that. You use their first order action, so of full GR, and you linearize that around flat space. And that's much easier because you don't need to do any, the work has been done for you already, right? You just need to linearize this thing. Okay, so that's the option which is the fastest if you know. So you take this and you linearize around flat space, and you just have to figure out how you should linearize around flat space, or any curved background for that matter. You know that the variables are the Gij, which is the metric induced on the initial surface, and the extrinsic curvature, and you have organized the G0I and the G00 into the lapse and the shift. And the only thing you have to realize is that the background, of course, is delta ij. Pi ij is 0 for the flat background, and the important thing is that the lapse is 1 plus a small lapse. That's what you, but there is a 1 here. That's an important guy, and the shift, of course, for flat space is 0. Okay, so n bar is 1, okay, n is 1 plus n, okay, I'm not doing this correctly. This is the background, and then you linearize around this background. Okay? And then what you are going to get is the following structure. So this is just what you are going to get is, of course, the D0 Hij pi ij minus the linearized lapse times the linearized spatial diffeomorphism constraint minus the linearized Hamiltonian constraint. And since you linearize around 1, you get the quadratic piece here, which is the Pauli-Fierz Hamiltonian, the integrand of the Pauli-Fierz Hamiltonian. That's quadratic in h and pi. Okay. And the good thing is that this scary Hamiltonian constraint, which is responsible for the stuff that you cannot solve in canonical quantization, which is this Wheeler-de Witt equation, of course it becomes linear and it's no longer very scary in that approach. Okay, but, so you get two things from the Hamiltonian constraint. The Hamiltonian of the gravitational waves, really, because now you have linearized. So this is the Hamiltonian of the gravitational waves, and the constraints, which are very much like electromagnetism, completely linear and controllable if you go to momentum space. Okay? Solvable, not like in the full nonlinear case. Is it clear? The point I'm trying to make? Okay, and then you have to figure out what boundary conditions, and this Martin did very beautifully. So you have to figure out what is the analog of perfectly conducting boundary conditions, because kind of we like them in the electromagnetic case, so let's do the analog of them in the gravitational case. So you take, and the point is that you take HAB and pi AB, A and B, let me remind you, are the directions transversal to the plates, sorry, along the plates, X and Y. And so these have to be 0 on the plate, so they are Dirichlet. They are sinuses, if you want. You do the pi 3, 3, and so two transverse directions will also be Dirichlet, and the G will also be Dirichlet, and the only ones that are Neumann is the pi A3 and the HA3. So there it's the third derivative that should be 0 on the plate. So they are Neumann. Okay, once you figure that out, the only thing that you have to figure out is this change of variables that we have done before that allows you to solve the constraint. Okay, so this decomposition in now you can go to Fourier space. Okay, and then this decomposition that DESA has given you into HTT, HT, and H longitudinal, you do it in Fourier space explicitly, because for this decomposition, like for vectors, you need 1 over delta to really write it, right? But in Fourier space, you have 1 over delta, so you can work it out. What is very nice is that you can use the polarization tensors, the polarization vectors of the electromagnetic case to build the appropriate polarization tensors out of it. So the only thing that you need to figure out is you do this thing, Ij, so this is TT Ij plus, and really Well, it's very nice. It's a way also to learn about gravitational waves, if you want, because now you know what plus is of so this plus polarization of gravitational waves. You do the E transverse traceless X, Ij, which is and you can prove that in this X polarization, this is where the additional stuff lies, the lower dimensional scalar lies in this X polarization. So remember that in the electromagnetic case, I already told you what these polarization vectors were. Out of these, you build the tensors, and they give you everything you need to solve the constraints. So you have this object here, and then you have the traceful part. Which has to do with the longitudinal polarization. And you do the longitudinal trace-free part, and there is an H version, and there is an E version of that, and it looks like this. Here I made a mistake. So this should be EI lambda EJ. And then you realize you organize all your Fourier components, and you realize that if you solve these constraints and you go to the reduced phase space, so either you can solve them in the action, or you do a gauge fixing. You can actually also directly solve in the action and see that none of these components, which are related to that survive in the action, and you only stay with these two polarizations. Okay, all the rest goes away. So this bit here and this bit here goes away with solving the constraints and going to the reduced phase space. And then you do the same oscillators to the scalar field that you had before, and you have exactly the same result than before. So nothing changes. You just have to adapt your system to solve the constraint, and you do the same thing than you had before. You work out what the spin angular momentum of light becomes in the gravitational case, and the only thing that you have to understand is how to generalize the curl. But there's a natural generalization of the curl to symmetric two tensors, which is the one Deser uses in all of his papers on this. So that's basically all you have to do. And then you find the same result for the partition function, etc. So there's just kinematically more involved. But at this level, there's no difference between gravity and electromagnetism, of course. Any questions on that?
So what is the physical interpretation of these boundary conditions? I mean,
very good, very good. I have no clue. And it's absolutely not clear. I mean, plates with perfectly conductive, so this is just a construct. Of course, the referee of the paper asked exactly the same question. And, no, but this we say very clearly. I mean, it's just, but you can also solve the system if you put just periodic boundary conditions. Then you have two scalars and so on. But what is interesting, I think, is that in the literature there is a long discussion whether you can put gravitons in a box. So, and it's a controversy which involves people like, on the one side, Smolin was doing arguments, can you put gravitons in a box? Then there was a paper by Wald and Garfinkel, where the box was supposed to be shells, which were collapsing, or I mean, really done out of black hole stuff, and this kind of surfaces. So the physical interpretation, I think you can do them if you think about horizons, where you know what the boundary conditions are, or and infinity. But I don't think you really can do boxes like that with, because otherwise you would need to know the analog of the electrons for the gravitational field, kind of. So, but there's an interesting controversy. The references are in our paper. So the names are Smolin. Can one put gravitons in a box? Or the other one is a paper by Wald and Garfinkel. One can put gravitons in a box. And the third one is by Dell, which says, no, but it's still not possible. So it's an interesting question. It's supposed to be an important question if this can be done. This is just computation. But the example of Walt and Garfinkel had an idealized, had a real one in GI.
What in 4 dimensions there is only just 2 degrees of freedom. So if you forget about Lorentz invariance, you just have 2 scalars and you put it to a box.
Yeah, but here you put it to a box consistent with boundary conditions of the box, and then you know that as well. Otherwise, and that's what I told in the very beginning, in the large volume limit, even gravitons in the large volume limit is like electric. There's 2 degrees of freedom per space-time point, and you get twice the scalar black-body result. But here you get twice the scalar result with the finite size correction.
But these boundary conditions, can you impose them just in terms of
That's a very good question. That's another good question. We can, but like in electromagnetism, so like I told you, in electromagnetism, the physical ones are this guy equal to 0 and this guy equal to 0. So there is the analog of that. And this is not one-to-one to the ones that I give in Dirichlet and Neumann, because precisely there is... well, you're always asking all the open questions. So there is the soft part also. First you have to translate. So you have to see what is the analog of these ones in terms of E and B, or in terms of this you can write in terms of F mu mu, also like something like that, normal to the boundary equal to 0. So really gauging boundary condition. You can do that for linearized gravity in terms of the electric part of the magnetic part. We know how that goes, and then we know that these are particular things, and then we know that there is more, which we hope would be soft stuff for that, but we have not worked it, we have not written it yet, because we don't even understand it in that case. So here we just do a minimal stuff, which we know works, and in which we can compute everything, and we hope that maybe they are natural, but we don't care, I would say. Just do what we can compute, to be honest. So this does not leave a lot of time for the Wörtlen approach, but let me mention it nevertheless. Okay, what's the third approach to compute a partition function? So this is well, at least the other approach that I learned by teaching quantum field theory. So teaching is very good because you learn all that stuff really well. So sometimes a bit of teaching is very good. Heat kernel and then word line. So I learned this from the book by Zine Justin, and this chapter is quite nice to see. So they're telling you that when you compute this partition function, which is -1/2 trace log of this so you know trace of this log, and then there is this representation using Schwinger proper time of this object like this. t trace exponential minus t h particle mu, where you suddenly have to compute this trace of this exponential operator, where this operator here is really the Hamiltonian for a particle in d+1 dimensional Euclidean space. And if you have this chemical potential, it's not just p squared, but it's p squared slightly shifted. But basically, you see that you have to compute the partition function of a free particle. If you want to control this object here, you have to think about the free particle of mass, in this case, m is equal to 1/2, because usually it will be 1/2m p squared, okay, in d+1 Euclidean space. They also have something like that in statistical field theory, where they do it discretized, and they talk about this transfer matrix, in which kind of the modular invariant should be more invariant. But this is a kind of already smoothed out version of it. So you have to compute this heat kernel, so you can do the of course you only need the trace, but you can do it more generally. You have, for this particle, you have to do this object here. And this thing, as I told you, is basically the Laplacian. It's p squared. So that's what you have to compute. And then you know what the heat kernel is. So you know it in the very simplest case. If it is on the real line, it is really the heat kernel that you know from your heat equation. So in that case, if it's just this without any mu, so you have to find this object here, which satisfies the differential equation that if you take d over dt, it's Laplacian of that you have to solve, and the initial condition is the delta function, then it's just really kind of the heat equation on the line. And the solution is, of course, very well known. It's 1 over square root of 4 pi t exponential minus x prime squared over 14. So all of this Seeley de Wit coefficients and all of these things starts from this heat kernel in flat space, and then you do perturbation around that. But this is really adapted to the high temperature limit, in a sense, right? It is starting from to the large box limit, because you start with a large thing and then you do correction. So it's really the opposite limit that is kind of natural in this approach, I would say. Okay, but then there is the question of what is this heat kernel if you are on a circle, if you are on a circle and not on a large space. Then there's two methods to compute it. One is to use a resolution of unity, and then you find that this heat kernel for the Laplacian just on the circle, which you find in most statistical field theory textbooks, you can express it in terms of the Jacobi theta function. Well, okay, I want to write a var theta, but can I do backslash var theta? Okay, I don't know, something theta 3 of x prime minus x over beta times I 4 pi beta squared t. Okay, so this is what you get from just inserting a resolution of unity here. You do p. Okay, you can always compute it like that if you want. Okay, so that's one expression that you get, and the other expression that you get, and okay, let me write it down. There is another expression that you get by doing the computation differently, which is much closer to the expression that you had in flat space, except that it takes kind of, this is always like, you remember when you go from this delta function on the line to the delta function with periodic thing, you have to do this sum over m's to make it kind of periodic, and sometimes it's called also method of images, because that's what it is in electromagnetism. But if you do it like that, you find x minus x over beta plus m squared over 14. So this is a computation that takes into account the path that's satisfied, including the ones. So it's really a path integral computation like you do it when you learn path integral in quantum mechanics, because it's not field theory, it's really a path integral for a particle. A path including those that wind around the circle, including those that, I have to admit, you know, when you're supposed to do the sum over all paths, to me it's never exactly clear what kind of path you should consider. So you just write those paths that wind around the circle, you put it in, and then you check that it gives what you had before, so that you are happy, that you have not forgotten everything. But this would be, and then you pretend sometimes that this is the independent path integral computation. But this is maybe just because I cannot really think in terms of path integrals and what are all the paths that wind around the circle. Okay, but in the end, you check that both methods give the same result, and in order to check that the result is the same, you have to use the Poisson summation formula. They are related by the standard formula that you can find, and then you see that they are basically the same by the Poisson summation formula. And then you go back to your problem that we have. So the problem that we have is, of course, first you can do RD, the black body result like that, where you have to combine the heat kernel on one circle with D heat kernels in the large direction. And then you do this computation, and when you compare the results that you get, in fact it tells you something mathematically, again, kind of interesting, which is the result that you get from that is in fact expressed in terms of a Mellin transform. So you see what is the Mellin transform of the zeta function, or rather, more precisely, this method of computation tells you that the zeta function is the Mellin transform of basically a Jacobi theta function. If you work it out, you find in this case, let me write the result, ln of z beta is going to be Vd over beta d. You get it as an integral representation. dt, and then I should say it's a t d plus 1 over 2 minus 1. Then you have to do everything correctly. So the equivalence of the two methods of computation of the black body result is telling you that psi d plus 1 is the Mellin transform of the theta function. That's what you learn like that, which you can then check in any book that does this series. You have to do analytic configurations and everything. And for the case we are interested in, this thing is really telling you what the real analytic Eisenstein series is the Mellin. And the only thing that you do in that case is, of course, that you combine the heat kernel on flat space with the heat kernel on the torus, if you want, or on these two things. And at the same time, this modular invariance or modular covariance becomes much more manifest. Because if you do it like this, and you do it correctly, and you parameterize the torus a bit more generally, not just by this complex parameter tau, but really by vectors that specify the periodicity, you go from covariance to SL2Z invariance, and you understand why SL2Z invariance should be there from the very beginning without checking it on the computation. So that's what you can gain on this approach. The other thing that we have not been able to do is getting the high temperature limit from there, as you were suggesting. That was something that I wanted to do, but we haven't done yet. Okay, let me stop here.